Hello, and welcome to Off the Fence, a podcast where we deconstruct difficult decision-making so we can figure out what keeps us stuck, and more importantly, how do we get unstuck? I'm your host, Karen Covey, a former divorce lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator turned coach, author, and entrepreneur. With me today is Andrew Hatherley, and Andrew is the founder and CEO of Wiser Divorce Solutions and Transcend Retirement, and the host of the Gray Divorce podcast. After going through his own gray divorce, Andrew decided to help others avoid the financial and emotional stress that is so common in the divorce process. Andrew earned the designation of Certified Divorce Financial Analyst and is trained in both divorce mediation and collaborative divorce. In 2022, Andrew started the Gray Divorce podcast, which is focused on mid to late life divorces. Andrew has over 25 years experience in investment management and financial planning. He's also studied with leaders in the field of humanistic and positive psychology and is a strong advocate for the role creativity can play in personal growth after trauma. Andrew has a master's of business administration from McGill University and ESADE. I don't know if I'm supposed to read the letters or just say ESAID. I don't know. Sorry about that. But Andrew has lived and worked in 5 countries and speaks Spanish. He loves to write, travel, play pickleball and tennis, and discuss classic movies. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm very happy to be here. Incidentally, it's ESADE. And for Spanish speakers out there, Escuela Superior de Administración y Dirección de Empresas.
That's beautiful. I'm glad you said it because I don't think I would have done that so well. So thank you very much. And we're talking today. I really wanted to have you on the show to talk about gray divorce, which is a thing now. And I know that in the circles that you and I run in, both of us know what gray divorce is. But in case our audience doesn't, can you explain a little bit about what a gray divorce is?
Sure. It's very simple. Gray divorce is people divorcing over the age of 50. And there's been a tremendous increase, since the 80s and 90s of the people over the age of 50 getting divorced. In 1990, I think it was 1 in 10. And now 3 in 10, over 3 in 10 people getting divorced are over the age of 50.
Why do you think that is? Why is there suddenly this surge in divorce later in life?
I mean, there's a number of reasons. I think one is societally, there's an increased acceptance of divorce that there wasn't 30, 40 years ago. And with that, a lot of people who might have been divorced 20, 30 years ago have gotten remarried. And studies have shown that the instances of divorce among second marriages are even higher than first marriages. So you have that happening. I think very important also is the increased economic independence of women. They've realized that they can go out on their own. They don't need to be tied to marriage necessarily. You've also got, of course, demographics. I think the average man is living to about 83 years of age now, and the average woman about 86. So with people living so long, they're considering whether or not they want to spend, the next 20, 30 years of their life with the same person. And if they're not happy, it's caused them to give that some consideration. And, I mentioned happiness. I think we can all acknowledge over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of growth in the personal development industry, let's call it. I mean, you yourself are a divorce coach, and, I don't think 20, 30 years ago that was well known of, or even coaching at all. So people are getting coaching, and there's been a big boom in positive psychology, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So people want to make the most of their lives, and sometimes they're thinking that is going to be by themselves, or not necessarily by themselves, but not with the same partner. Maybe they want to find a different partner.
Right. That makes perfect sense. I mean, when you're only living to, I don't know what the average lifespan was 100 years ago, but let's say it was 65 or 70.
Right.
Well, when you're 65 and you figure, well, I could get a divorce, but I could be dead before I get a divorce if that's your average lifespan. But when the lifespan increases, now all of a sudden things look a little different, right? And I
For
know
sure.
your journey with gray divorce started with your own divorce. Can you
Mhm.
explain to the audience how your own experiences inform the work that you do now?
Yes, when I went through my divorce, my only divorce, at the age of 52, and I didn't realize at the time that I was part of a societal phenomenon. Believe me, it was very much centered on the process itself and dealing with getting it done. And it wasn't a pleasant experience. And I'm a financial advisor, and I've been working in financial services since the 90s. And this is a huge financial decision being made in one's life. It's probably the largest financial transaction in one's life, and it's being made at a time when the emotions can be very frayed, and it's not an ideal scenario at all to be making such a big financial decision when the emotions are frayed. And so, with a gray divorce in your 50s, you know it's even more pronounced because you don't have as much time to make up for what's essentially is a splitting of your net worth. I mean, the marital assets are being split, so your net worth is being cut in half with divorce. And there can be associated costs going forward as well, like spousal support. So from the putting on my financial advisor hat, going through this, I thought, boy, I learned a lot because I was completely ignorant. I'm embarrassed to say how ignorant I was about the divorce process beforehand. And I thought, boy, I could really educate people here. And my first impulse was, as a financial advisor, to think educate people financially, both before, during, and after the process. So that encouraged me to earn the CDFA designation, Certified Divorce Financial Analyst, in addition to my retirement designation. So help people going through the process, separate fact from fiction, and afterwards understand that, or try to help people build the financial foundation for a meaningful life after divorce. And I found initially after the divorce, the focus was on the financial, but it became more on the emotional and psychological because I had committed to resetting my life and growing personally and professionally. And I thought, well, let's incorporate that element too to helping people.
Mhm.
And so it's infused my work with a lot more personal satisfaction to help people because I've gone through the situation, and anything I can do to help people in a similar situation understand that there's light at the end of the tunnel, both emotionally, psychologically, and financially.
Well, let's talk for a minute. I want to wind you back to the financial
Yes.
part for a moment, if we can, and we'll get to the other stuff as well, because I think that all of it is very important. But you said that when going through a divorce is one of the biggest financial decisions that probably you're going to make in your life. Can you elaborate on that? And is this just one financial decision? Is it a series of decisions? What is it from a financial perspective that people need to think about when they're facing divorce or deciding whether to do this, particularly in a gray divorce situation?
Well, the big thing about the financial aspect from a gray divorce situation is that typically, if you're over 50 or over 60, heck, I've even heard recently from an attorney about people in their 80s getting
Yep.
divorced. Um, it's a factor of time. When you're 20 or 30, and let's say you're getting divorced in your 30s, you've got probably another 30, maybe 40 working years ahead of you to put money aside for retirement. In your 50s and 60s, you don't have the luxury of time on your side. So you want to make sure that when you're dividing the assets, you're doing it in a way that dividing assets and negotiating spousal support is that you've putting yourself on a decent foundation going forward. And it's also with respect to training and education going forward, because with women in particular, they find it tougher financially going forward. And a lot of studies have shown, there's a recent study It's very good. It says that the standard of living of women over the age of 50 after divorce declines to the order of about 45%, whereas men it's about 21%. So
Wow.
there's a number of decisions with respect to the house, with respect to retirement plans, and you often see a gender divide with respect to the house and retirement plans. Mothers with the maternal instinct, if there are children involved, and even older children, or if they've been in the house for a long time, they want to stay in the house. But it can be tricky if there's a lot of equity there, because that's tied up in the house, and you can't go to the grocery store and say, hey, I've got $500,000 tied up in my house. Give me a pound of prime rib. You need to make sure that your divorce negotiations somehow account for budgeting going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And with men, they tend to look at their retirement plans as, I think of the creature from Lord of the Rings, and my precious, the ring, he's crawling.
Gollum.
That's Gollum. That's the guy. And so I talked about the emotions getting involved. Well, sometimes it makes more sense to either sell the house, downsize, find some sort of cash out scenario where income needs and cash flow needs, because ultimately cash flow is where a lot of stress comes from. It's like paying those bills. And so in combining, my financial planning background with the divorce work I do, a lot of attorneys are about dividing the assets and, relatively equal sides of the ledger. That's fine, but you want to be able to manage your cash flow as well. So I incorporate a financial planning aspect to the work I do with divorcing people to make sure they're on a good foundation going forward.
Well, what you're talking about, cash flow, that's money in, money out, budgeting, for lack of a better word, not anyone's favorite word or concept, but very necessary, particularly in a divorce situation. But can you talk a little bit to the point of, let's say you've got a couple and they're 65, right? So they are older than you were when you went through it. They're already, and let's say they are already retired. So their income is pretty fixed. I mean, it is what it is, and that's what it's going to be moving forward. And now all of a sudden, that's divided in half. I mean, does one spouse still, what does that do to support obligations? What does that do to cash flow? What does that do to the decisions people have to make about, is this a good idea to do this, or should I just tough it out?
Well, that's whether or not someone should tough it out is certainly a unique situation for each individual. And that's where working with a coach such as yourself can be a great benefit. And I'm a big believer in bringing other professionals into the process as early as possible, with divorce coaches, divorce lending practitioners. They can play a particularly strong role, particularly, as I mentioned, lending in this day and age, because you find with gray divorcees, let's say you mentioned people 65. Well, 65-year-olds tend, not always, but tend to have a lot more equity in their properties. So, and they tend to have retirement assets saved, not always, but more so than someone in their 30s. They tend to have more retirement assets and more equity in the house. And that's where creative solutions can come into play with respect to extracting cash from the sale of the house. And recent developments in mortgage financing and reverse mortgage financing are allowing people there's some creative solutions out there that can work for people in the house. And the house is a key asset, certainly. Another thing is, typically if someone's 65 and divorced, unless it's a second marriage, typically they've been married for 10 years. So a spouse is entitled to half of the Social Security of the higher Social Security payment, and it doesn't affect either the payment at all from the person receiving it. If the husband's getting $3,000 a month and the wife would be getting $500, then she can get $1,500. So that's a consideration to take into effect. As I mentioned, the reverse mortgages in the 60s, that becomes an option. But you're right.
I just want to interrupt for a second. For somebody who doesn't know what a reverse mortgage is, can you explain that for a minute?
I know enough about it to be dangerous. So I work with some very good certified divorce lending professionals, and I would suggest seeking counsel there. But essentially, it's a way of taking equity from your existing home, potentially using it as down payment towards a new home, but not having a mortgage, essentially. But when you pass on, the house is not yours anymore.
Got it. So it sounds like there's a lot of options out there that people might not have thought about or might not know about going into the divorce process, which speaks very much to your point of getting a team with the right professionals on it, so that you understand what all of your options are, things you might not have known about. And that is actually really kind of cool, because it inserts an element of hope into this whole process, which would otherwise be or could be very, very overwhelming and dark. And another thing that I wanted to talk with you about, because I know it's one of your really strong suits, is, the hope of post-traumatic growth. We've all heard about post-traumatic stress and how horrible it is to go through trauma and the effects of trauma. What is post-traumatic growth, and how does it play in particularly to a gray divorce situation?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up, Karen. I just want to backtrack a little bit, because when I do my divorce workshops, if there's any message that I want to get across in these workshops, it's that there is life after divorce. Because when you're in the middle of the process, your imagination's running wild. You think the worst is going to happen. And it's often based on incorrect information. I know, I remember hearing, you're going to have to pay spousal support for the rest of your life. Well, no, that was probably never in the cards, but I didn't know because I was uneducated about the process. So, and of course, going through this, your amygdala is triggered. You're seeing saber-toothed tigers around every corner. So you're not thinking straight. So that's the kind of the first point that I want to get across, is that there is life after divorce. And I personally experienced it. I would say for the first year or so, year and a half after divorce, I wasn't in a great place emotionally, because, you're disappointed. And of course, as a financial advisor, you see your net worth cut in half, and that doesn't feel very good. Some of your savings, a lot of your savings are gone. And so financially, that started to feel better when I put a plan in place to rebuild. But then emotionally and psychologically, I started kind of getting out of my head a little bit. And I found by looking outwards, as opposed to kind of, focusing on, woe is me, I thought, well, let's try and turn this around, the proverbial making lemonade. And so I started Wiser Divorce Solutions, which is my CDFA business, but also committed, and this is crucial, it's so simple, but committed to a healthier lifestyle. And so simple elements such as sleep, diet, and exercise, just can't underestimate the benefit of those components in your life, and just put you in a better mindset. And if I work out now, it's not so much, yes, there's an element of wanting to be able to fit into my clothes and look half decent in my clothes, but I think more than anything, it's it's the way I feel after exercising and working out. So this continued, and it became a virtuous cycle. So the exercise and the diet and sleep gave me more energy, and that gave me the energy to actually write a novel with a partner of mine, which is something that I've always wanted to do. In the process, lost 16 pounds, opened, as I said, a new business. I now have two businesses, and started these divorce workshops. And this experience, this positive experience after divorce, I mentioned educating people about the financial aspect, but this positive growth experience that I started to go through about 2 or 3 years after the divorce encouraged me to learn more about positive psychology. And of course, that's when I came across the term post-traumatic growth, which I believe was coined by a psychologist by the name of Richard Tedeschi.
Mhm.
And he talks about how it's really how resilient we are is really underrated. And in society today, I think we're getting away from that a little bit. And we're becoming a little, excuse the editorial, but a little too victim minded, where we have strength inside and we have resilience. And that's what he emphasized. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get across through my experience to my clients. And Tedeschi talks about how we can work with people, and he uses the term expert companion, working with people. And I'm not a psychologist, but I just try and help people based on the experience I had, and guiding people through education and discussing what they've gone through to the possibilities that lay beyond divorce.
But, I want to point out, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And, I think you are a testament to your life, and what you've accomplished since your divorce is a testament to what's possible. And I really hope that people hear that, because when you're in the middle of the divorce and all the misery and you're watching money fly out the door because you're paying all the professionals, and now you're going to have to split everything, and you don't know what's going to happen to you or your kids or your family. And it doesn't matter what age your kids are. Even adult children have got an opinion about their parents' divorce, and it affects them.
Everybody's got an opinion.
Everybody has an opinion. And so, the bottom line is it's multifaceted, and you're watching all these horrible things happen, and it's easy to get stuck in the poor me, my life sucks, it's always going to suck mentality. But you don't have to stay there, and you didn't stay there, and the things that happened to you were amazing. But if you could just share a little bit about what you've learned from Richard Tedeschi's work about, are you just an outlier? Were you just the one guy who got it all together after divorce and figured it out and is rocking and rolling and really leading a fulfilling life? Or is this really possible for people who have had, especially a bad divorce?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. And you talked about, when you're going through divorce, there's a saying in the legal community that whereas the criminal justice system sees people on their best behavior in court, and we're talking about people who may have tattoos saying nasty things on their forehead, but they go into court with a suit and tie and they're like, yes, sir, no, sir. The divorce world sees pretty normal, good people on their worst behavior. And part of that is the woe is me. That's part of the whole process as well as anger and resentment, all those things. So I think moving out of that, getting out of that, there's a period of relief, and then there's maybe a transitionary period of questioning. But if I've seen, I'm not the only instance for sure. I mean, I know people who've enjoying very happy lives moving forward after divorce. And I want to branch out a little bit from Tedeschi, because I think positive psychology is full of tools that we can use to help ourselves going forward. And I know if any of our listeners are familiar with the work of either Martin Seligman, who wrote a book called Flourish. I know I was been strongly influenced by Scott Barry Kaufman's book, Transcend, and I did a course with him on self-actualization. Certainly, I think the work of Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, has been very important. I know he can be a polarizing figure politically, but as a psychologist, he's done some important work with respect to growth. And I think the key is we think we understand ourselves, but when we go through this very difficult process, we start to question it a little bit. And I think that's a good thing, because there are tools out there that I use that really help me focus on building myself back up. And I think particularly of the Big Five personality test, which is much more accepted among the psychological community than some other psychological tests. I mean, I used to be a Myers-Briggs fan, and I still
Back in the day.
I kind of think Myers-Briggs is kind of like the astrology of personality tests. Although I still play with it a lot. I'm an INTJ, and all, I have the INTJ characteristics. But I think the Big Five personality test is much more in-depth understanding of our personality. And there's also a tool called the VIA Strengths Finder, which I think is very useful because it focuses on our core strengths. And I think that's what we need to build on going forward. And so, this may be controversial, but a lot of people say, follow your passion, follow your bliss. Yes, I get that. But if you can incorporate your passion and your bliss to what you're good at, you're much more likely to be successful. And so, I think Cal Newport as well. I love sharing all these books and things that I've read. He wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he expands on this idea of it's not enough to follow your bliss. I mean, if my bliss was to be a ballet dancer, I think it would end in tears. Or a football, or go back to playing hockey. I only played roller hockey. If you put me on skates, it would not be a good situation. So what am I good at? And if I can incorporate the things that bring passion to my life into what I'm actually good at, it's much more likely to be positive. And I'm all about trying to get a positive cycle going, as opposed to a vicious cycle, a positive cycle. Now, my life is not perfect, believe me, but I haven't been to the gym in 2 weeks, and I'm getting grumpy. Well, I've had a cough, and it's been annoying. But if you can try and trigger a positive cycle as opposed to a negative cycle. And I found that getting out of my head was a big factor in that. There's a term called helper's high. Have you ever heard the term helper's high?
No, I have not.
It's funny. I used it a couple of weeks ago. I was helping my mother-in-law put her TV on the wall. And I remember driving home with my wife afterwards and thinking, well, that felt good. I've got a bit of a helper's high. I installed my mother-in-law's TV set. But also get this from the divorce workshops as well, because people come in and, you can see the weight of the world on their shoulders, and just disabusing them of some crazy ideas that might have been given by their sister or their brother or their drinking buddy about what's going to happen in divorce. You can see the relief coming over them. It's still a lot of work to do, but that getting out of your head. And as an introvert and an only child, believe me, I've spent a lot of time in my own head, but I found that getting out of that is probably a good recipe for feeling better about one's life.
That brings us full circle back to what you were saying before about how the lifestyle changes make such a big difference. And I think that's something that not a lot of people talk about in the context of divorce. It's like, hey, I've already got enough things going on. I don't need to worry about getting enough sleep and eating right and diet and all those things, but it all ties together. And to your point, what you just said, getting out and going to the gym helps you get out of your own head. Helping other people, that gives you a sense, the helper's high. I hadn't heard the term, but the idea is you're going to feel better when you're focused on something that's not you and your misery.
Yes. It's so important. And I know it can sound overwhelming, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the book that's been at the top of the bestseller list for the last Lord knows how many years, James Clear's Atomic Habits. And he talks about just develop one good habit. And let's say it's waking up early. Okay, so you're waking up early with a good night's sleep. Okay, so you've had a good night's sleep. What's something positive that can build on that? Well, maybe taking a walk. And so maybe you can build on that. Maybe 2 or 3 days a week. You don't have to go to the gym. You can just lift weights in your garage, because ultimately it's that weight resistance, I think, that really gets the body and mind working, releasing all the chemicals in a positive way. And these things just kind of build on each other. A good night's sleep can build on exercise, which can build on, well, I don't want to have an Egg McMuffin for breakfast after I've woken up early and gotten some exercise. So let's eat a healthy breakfast. And then we find we have more energy during the day. And so if it's a positive cycle versus a potentially negative cycle. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote, just to what you were saying. About a year after my divorce, I was still feeling pretty depressed, and I mentioned it to my doctor. And a lot of our listeners would not be surprised that the doctor's solution for this sense was this depression was, well, we can do this, and they all end with sin, right? Something sin, something that, or I think that's it, or tin or sin. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Antidepressant. And I thought, and I kind of made a joke at that time, and I said to him, "Hey, doc, shouldn't you have said something like diet and exercise?" Because he didn't. And I guess he thought that I wanted antidepressants, but I didn't. I just wanted to get his opinion. And so ultimately I said, no, I'm going to pass on that. Give me a couple of months with diet and exercise and see how that goes. And maybe I knew that in my head all along. Maybe I just wanted confirmation. But you can see how a reliance on alcohol or drugs can lead to a negative cycle versus the potential positive. Now, I'm not a doctor, and some people need medication. So, always, go with your physician's recommendations. But if possible, it's best to go in a way that the positive habits build on one another.
Absolutely. And I think that what you're saying is a good example. And of course, there's a place for medication 100%. But it's not the only solution, I think, is the point you're trying to make.
Right.
And what's important for people to hear is that you can have a negative cycle or you could have a positive cycle. And the difference between the two is you. Which one are you going to choose? Because it is a choice. People have a tendency, especially in a negative situation, and divorce is negative. I mean, straight up, right? But in that kind of situation, we all have a tendency to go, oh, poor me. Where's, I need a drink. I need another glass of wine. I might, whatever your drug of choice is now. And nowadays there are plenty to choose from, right? So, and you stay on the couch and you eat poorly and you watch Netflix and you blah, 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 blah. And it's okay to do those kinds of things when you're, in the depths of your divorce once in a while for like a day, right? But when one day leads to 2, leads to 12, leads to months, leads to years, I mean, now you've got that negative spiral going down. And what you're an example of is it doesn't have to be that way. It can go the opposite direction.
You want to try to develop an addiction to feeling good, but to feeling good through your own, what's the word? Your own, there's a fancy word for it, but your own actions.
Mm-hmm.
And let's face it, it feels so much better to, I would imagine, because I've never taken diet pills or anything like that, but I imagine it feels so much better to get fit or fitter, let's say. I would say I'm fitter, not fit, from your own work than it is, lipo or that sort of thing.
Right. And what the other thing that I want to point out that you spurred an idea in me is I've worked with so many people and so many clients going through a divorce who lack confidence. They say, you know what, I've been in a difficult marriage for X number of years and it's just wore me down, and they don't believe in themselves anymore. And they say, what am I going to do? I'm just a mess. No, you're not just a mess. To your point, by doing the diet and the exercise and the lifestyle things, things that are not easy necessarily to do, especially to start if you haven't been used to doing that, right? All of a sudden you make those changes, and then that makes you feel good about yourself. You've accomplished something hard, and that starts to feed the virtuous cycle and
Yes.
take you in a whole different direction. So
No, exactly. And I just wanted to add there, because I think one thing I forgot to mention before is I had tried for many years. I started smoking again in 2008. And I tried several times from 2008 to 2017, 2018 to quit smoking. And so I moved from cigarettes to vape, but I ultimately sensed that vape wasn't good for me either. But it was only until 2019, and I think it was a natural culmination of doing other things that led me to quit smoking. But I quit entirely. And the funny thing is, there's something that goes on in our bodies and our minds with respect to cravings. And so we may sit at the sofa with chips and dip and a beer every night, but there are ways that we can eliminate those cravings. And I haven't craved a cigarette maybe once or twice in the last 4 years. And before that, many times. Many times. And I keep hoping that, I don't think about cigarettes very often, fortunately. But when I remember, and I'm proud of the fact that I haven't had a cigarette or vape for that, or vape, nothing, for 4 years, I'm thinking, wow, I think that was just a natural outgrowth of the physical and psychological improvements that were put into effect by simple changes, like not eating after 7 o'clock at night, or even 6 o'clock at night, because you get a better sleep. Certainly not drinking after 6 o'clock at night.
mhm.
And just, as you said, became ultimately a positive cycle.
That is awesome. Well, I just want to shift gears here before we wrap this up and talk about your podcast. Tell me how, what was the genesis of that? And if people are interested in gray divorce, what are they going to find or hear on your podcast?
We cover all the ranges of life on the Gray Divorce podcast. As a matter of fact, the most recent episode was the second part of an interview I did with dating and love coach Maria Spears, who I think you know.
Yeah, I do. She was on this podcast too.
Oh, terrific. So we talked about dating after gray divorce. There's an episode where I talk about Social Security and gray divorce and mortgage lending. So you asked a question about reverse mortgages, and I mentioned Social Security. Go to those podcasts. We've got experts talking about those things in much greater detail. We talk about mediation and collaborative divorce, alternatives to the litigious process, which is so harmful both emotionally and financially. You can find on my website, transcendretirement.net. There's the podcast page, and it's on all the podcast directories. So it's out there.
This has been so wonderful. You have been a wealth of not just information, but inspiration. So thank you so much for being here. Can you tell our listeners where the best places to find you? Where can they find you?
First of all, I'll say thank you for that compliment, because I'm a believer that the best thing that anybody can do for another person is to inspire them to be the best version of themselves. So I appreciate that. And people can find me. Transcendretirement.net is my webpage for my business, essentially working with people as a financial planner, financial advisor after divorce. They can also find me on wiserdivorcesolutions.com. That's my CDFA business, where I work with people before and during divorce. And
Awesome.
Just look up the Gray Divorce podcast on any of the podcast directories. And that's Gray with an A.
Yeah, I know. There's a big controversy. Is it gray with an E, gray with an A? Turns out, I think it depends on which side of the pond you live on, so to speak. In Britain, the other direction, but it just is what it is.
It's a conflict for me because I was born in England, and so I think it's an E over there. But the research that I did seems to show that A is a little bit more prevalent.
That makes sense. So again, Andrew, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who are out there listening or watching or consuming this podcast in whatever way works for you, all I can say is if you like it, if you enjoy what you hear and you want to hear more, give this episode a thumbs up, like, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast, and we'll talk to you again next time.